Hi, I'm Lisa Fletcher, and you're in the stream. Today, what happens after Newtown? A wave of public reaction to the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary. Is the United States ready to turn outrage into action? Our digital producer, Malika Bilal, is here looking out for all your live feedback. She will be bringing in your comments and questions throughout the show. Malika, I've been looking at the tweets coming in all day, and while there are still people on the extreme right and the extreme left of this issue, it seems a lot of people are calling for just some rational discussion somewhere in the middle.
Discussion, exactly, and that's definitely what we're seeing. And around the height of this, of course, we saw mentions of Newtown, for example, hit 450,000 mentions, which is a lot. But I think an interesting comparison is what happened after the Colorado shootings in July. And I pulled up this graph on my screen. The hashtag theater shooting got more than 500,000 tweets. But then, as you can see, of course, it dropped off just a couple of days later. So it's interesting to see what will happen this time and whether this public interest will produce change. And of course, we want you at home to join the conversation. Tweet us with the hashtag AJStream.
And to Malika's right is Dr. Priscilla Das-Brailsford. She's a trauma psychologist and associate professor of psychiatry at Georgetown University's Medical Center. She studies the effects of trauma and violence on people and on society, specifically on communities. Priscilla, thanks for being here. Now, there are a lot of ways you can be in our conversation. Twitter, of course, is one of them, as Malika mentioned. But for those of you who prefer to leave longer comments, I'm right there with you. Write us using Facebook. Go to facebook.com/AJStream and join our conversation there.
My name is Muaz Mustafa. I work for the Syrian Revolution, and I'm in the stream.
America is seeing an unprecedented reaction to the latest mass shooting in the U.S. at a Connecticut elementary school. News organizations, both online and on TV, and nearly every form of social media, have covered the event since it unfolded. Emotions are high as the topic remains the center of conversation. And as TV pundits and personalities argue over gun control policies and inadequate mental health care, many questions are being raised, but few answers given. The shocking mass murder that claimed the lives of 20 children and 7 adults has Americans at a loss for how and why this happened. They took to social media to share information, debate, raise awareness, and offer prayers and sympathies. Hashtags like Newtown and Sandy Hook, like Malika mentioned, were trending immediately. Bloggers joined in, each offering his or her own take on the event in Newtown. And while the outrage and horror is heightened over the fact that 20 children were gunned down, the wave of public interest is not new. It's happened before, and then it's faded rather quickly. So will things be different this time? Will the circumstances force meaningful dialogue that could lead to change? Or will the country remain deeply divided on gun control and on mental health? To help us answer some of these questions, we're joined by 3 other guests. Via Skype from New York City is Michael Skolnick, editor-in-chief of globalgrind.com and political director to Russell Simmons. And in our Google Plus Hangout, we're joined by Eric Garland, writer and blogger, and Adam Clark Estes, writer and associate editor of Motherboard TV. Welcome to all of you guys.
Thank you.
Michael, I want to start with you. As we just mentioned, this isn't the first time Americans have been confronted with horrific mass murder. We mentioned a few of the incidents, and while people have been horrified and captivated by them, the fear and the outrage peaks, and then it disappears. Is there something different about the Connecticut incident that's going to take this moment and bring reasonable people together on both sides and put aside these personal ideologies and actually work to create meaningful change?
Well, thank you for having me on this show. I think that, it's not the last time either, unfortunately. Since Friday, we've had a number of shootings and deaths, including 10 shootings in a 24-hour period in Chicago alone, directly after the shootings in Newtown. So the shooting continues and the death continues in this country, unfortunately. I do think, however, having covered this and having been an advocate for decades on this issue, I do think that there might be a tipping point. There might be a moment when you see Jack Pinto, a 6-year-old child's casket being laid to rest, when you see 7-year-old children being laid to rest. I think it touches a different place in the heart for many people across this country, especially many mothers and fathers across this country. You saw the president on Friday. Rarely do we see our commander-in-chief shed a tear in public, and this is the second time we've seen him shed a tear almost in the past 2 months. So I think this resonated with him. I hope However, I have great confidence in the American people and great confidence in the compassion of the people of this country that we will continue to pressure our politicians and pressure our elected officials to get something done quickly in fear that another catastrophe or another national media story might take over and some will forget. So I would hope that the people who are listening to this can continue the pressure on our politicians so this can get done very quickly and we don't have this lingering on for months to come.
Right, and you mentioned pressuring elected officials. Our community members are weighing in on what they think needs to be done. Linda Sarsour says it's simple: ban on assault weapons. But Adam, I want to direct this next one to you. It's an exchange on our stream.aljazeera.com page. This is from Peter, who says, sorry, banning guns has done nothing in countries like Australia. They now attract and cause more fear and trauma with their machetes, iron bars, oversized knives. Raphael, of course, counters that right below him and says, that's ridiculous. We don't have biannual mass executions with machetes. You can run away from a knife. Adam, what's the appropriate response to incidents like this?
It's hard to say. I think that beginning with the conversation really helps, but the action is going to have to be taken to stop gun violence. We're seeing now more than ever before that Americans really are exponentially more likely to be involved in a violent event involving a gun than elsewhere. You know, a recent study I read showed that Americans are 100 times more likely to die in a gun-related death in the U.S. than in the United Kingdom, which has similar gun laws to Australia. And I sort of agree that we don't see mass killings with machetes affecting our communities in America. And all these instances, there are guns, and often big guns, assault rifles, that can kill many people in one go.
You know, a lot of TV personalities have been reacting to the shock of innocent children being killed at an elementary school. One reaction that received a lot of attention was MSNBC's Joe Scarborough, where he delivered a 10-minute monologue at the start of his Morning Joe program. Now, Joe is a former Republican congressman who received the NRA's highest rating over 4 terms in Congress. And he told his viewers that the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary in Newtown challenged his long-held beliefs on gun rights, making his ideologies of his past career no longer relevant. Take a look.
We've said this before, after Columbine, after Arizona, after Aurora, after so many other numbing hours of murder and massacre. But let this be our true landmark. Let Newtown be the hour after which, in the words of the New Testament, we did all we could do to make all things new. The violence we see spreading from shopping malls in Oregon to movie theaters in Colorado to college campuses in Virginia to elementary schools in Connecticut. It's being spawned by the toxic brew of a violent popular culture, a growing mental health crisis, and the proliferation of combat-styled weapons.
Michael, what impact does it have when a strong, well-respected conservative voice like Joe Scarborough takes this kind of stand on the issue? Does it shift the national discussion?
Well, I certainly think that it only can help when someone like Joe Scarborough, speaks out against, the incredible violence. My issue is this, though, and I'd say this, as frankly as I possibly can. We have young people dying in this country every single day. Every single day, 85 people are shot in this country. Almost more than half of those are suicides, and about 35 to 40 of them are homicides. So, I talk to families, I talk to mothers, I talk to fathers every single day who lose their children to a gun. I am a little frustrated with those who believe in the Second Amendment but don't believe that their Second Amendment should have limitations. So in that sense, yes, this might be a tipping point, and yes, the time has come, and yes, whatever holy book you might read, and it has some quote that you want to quote that says that you have to come and take care of our children, enough already. We we can have any conversation about Australia, about Great Britain, about Germany, about France, but we are America. This is our country. Let's not compare ourselves to them. Let's compare ourselves to ourselves, and let's do better. There is absolutely no reason whatsoever that a person should have access to a weapon of war. Period. Now, is that going to solve the problem? No. But do we need to at least start somewhere? Absolutely.
Priscilla, Michael raises a good point in that these shootings, while they may not be on a giant scale, are happening every single day in this country. Why does it take a massive event like what happened in Connecticut for people to connect with this?
It's because our attention gets drawn when something of this nature happens. I mean, it is happening every day, but we don't hear about it as much as we did because of this was a mass shooting. You know, it drew attention. The other thing that drew our attention around the Connecticut shooting is the age of the children. You know, children, especially kindergarten children, are most vulnerable, and they were affected. You know, they were the victims, and I think that's what hits home closely for a lot of people. The age of the victim.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Eric, I want to direct this next one to you. It's a video comment we just received. Have a listen.
Hi, I'm Mikey from Southgate, California, and I guess all I have to say is it's not whether gun policy is going to change, because new laws are going to be enacted. That's not the question. The question is whether these policies are going to have any teeth to them. Are they going to change a society that is so gun-loving and gun-centric? And that's what really needs to change.
Eric, if you could elaborate and also answer the question, are we a society that is so gun-loving and gun-centric?
More than almost any other place on Earth. I mean, we have 300 million weapons, small arms, floating around the American population. And there's an enormous amount of cultural myth about this. And you know, I've been talking a lot about this online recently, been writing about it, and I'm hearing from all sorts of folks that are comparing their lives to what was going on this continent in the 1770s, where people rose up with their muskets and shot their British overlords and won our freedom. And we are all taught that myth as we learn American history, and it is very close to us. There is a tradition of owning weapons in a great number of the parts of the United States. I'm from the state of Vermont, which is one of the most armed places on Earth. We have guns everywhere. We also have the lowest crime, and that's because of our culture and because we have very few urban areas. It's different in the South, it's different out West. But there, almost anywhere you go in the United States, particularly the rural areas, there's some relationship to guns. Now, when we move that up to what is happening in the last 20 or 50 years with the militarization of America and the use of popular culture to celebrate violence, and when you see the gun manufacturers themselves using these ads, you know, I was looking at one for the Bushmaster rifle that this perpetrator used, and it says, "Your man card was just reissued."
Okay,
but that's not. They don't just do those ads for nobody. They know there's
But talk about this. Talk about the fundamentally different social and cultural attitude. You mentioned it in Vermont. You could apply it to Israel. You could apply it to Switzerland, where many, many, many people have firearms. In Switzerland, you see people with rifles slung everywhere, but a very low incidence of violence. What is fundamentally different about the social attitude in these places?
Well, in Switzerland, and I've been hearing a lot of comparisons, well, you know, they have guns everywhere in Switzerland. Well, let's talk about that. Their guns, they're trained on those guns. They are working together as a local militia. They have a sense of communal responsibility.
But shooting's also a national sport in Switzerland. I mean, it's just something you grew up doing.
Yeah, it's, you know, I grew up around weapons, and it's, you know, firearms are no more common than silverware where I'm from. But seriously, and you know how to use them. And you know, I was taught very early. Somebody hands you a rifle and you let the barrel, you know, come up, and your dad grabs it and puts it towards the floor and says, "Don't be an idiot." And you hold it in the crook of your arm, and you always have the safety on. And there's a culture. You don't necessarily have to be terrified of firearms, but in Switzerland, the government knows where these guns are. You're supposed to keep it in your home a certain way. Mm-hmm. I believe your home is inspected. And none of the gun lobby in the United States is suggesting that they have the government come and inspect. We are going to have a well-regulated militia.
Well, I want to get to that a little bit later in the show, too. What is the role of the gun lobby in terms of leading a reasonable charge here on some sort of reform? But while so much of the discussion seems to be centered around guns, and rightfully so, there's also this issue of inadequate mental health care, and it's come up a lot during the last few days. A lot of people are talking about how mental health played a role in the shootings in Newtown, and one blogger, she triggered a big reaction. Her name is Liza Lang, and she's the mother of a mentally ill child. And on her personal blog, it's called Anarchist Soccer Mom, She reacted to the Connecticut shooting in a piece that she called "I Am Adam Lanza's Mother," and she was hoping to start a national conversation about mental health. And she wrote, "I live with a son who is mentally ill. I love my son, but he terrifies me." And then she goes on to say, "I'm sharing this story because I am Adam Lanza's mother, and these boys and their mothers need help. In the wake of another horrific national tragedy, it's easy to talk about guns, but it's time to talk about mental illness." Now, Liza's piece went viral. It triggered a lot of responses. Some agreed. Some feared that it was going to further stigmatize those with mental illness. Priscilla, just a few hours ago, President Obama held a press conference. He was discussing the shooting, and while he mentioned mental health, it certainly wasn't spotlighted. If Americans can't talk about it and discuss this very important issue of mental health now, at a time like this, when is it going to happen? When is the conversation going to take place?
I don't know. I mean, it comes up all the time after all these incidents, these horrific incidents that have happened. The issue of mental health and mental illness actually is what it is. It's not mental health, it's mental illness. Comes up, but again, we have the conversation, we talk about it, and then nothing happens after that. I think one of the really big issues around mental illness is the stigma that's associated with it, and that's a societal conversation. You know,
Who starts that conversation?
Well, obviously, the woman, I forget her name. She,
Lisa Lang.
Liza Lang. Yeah, I had read that too. It was a very touching story. And you know, when you read it, you'll see that there was so many places that she looked for help in, and she didn't get what she needed. You know, ended up reporting her son to the police. You know, him being taken and then calming down and sending him home, and yet she was still terrified.
Is it true that a lot of people who suffer from mental illness don't actually get their first bit of help until they're actually in jail?
That is true, yes. Unfortunately, it is, because they get misdiagnosed or undiagnosed or never seek services. I think that's a big issue. You can have services, but unless people seek them, you know, nothing's going to happen.
You know, Adam, Priscilla touches on an important point here. This is something we have to and must talk about, but I know one of your concerns is that we have to talk about it in the right way so it doesn't further stigmatize people who have mental illness.
I really agree with that, and I think that we run a big risk of talking about gun violence and mental health in the same breath, because they aren't necessarily always that linked. Only about 4% of crimes in America involve people with a mental illness, which means that 96% of them involve people that are perfectly healthy.
And you know, there are people out there watching right now saying, don't you have to be mentally ill to commit an atrocity like this?
You know, but this is a good question about when diagnosis, which is what Adam's bringing up, is that if you look at the classic DSM-4 diagnoses of mental illness, ADHD or bipolar or schizophrenia, there's no literature that says that is linked to violence or mass murder. It's another more broad form of psychopathic behavior, and that's what we need to get into.
Michael, I want you to follow up on this, but before you do, we're getting the personal reflections from one mother, P. Mimi, who says, as a pediatrician and a mom of a teen son with severe mental health issues, I also want better ancillary support for caregivers. She says we can start by fully funding mental and behavioral services that have been cut in school districts. But Michael, the point I want you to address is this from Cynthia, who says, I think the problem is the argument over which is the bigger problem, guns or mental health. Maybe we should focus more on both. And then as an addition to that, of course, this idea of mental health usually comes in when we get shootings of this level, but it doesn't come in as much when we see shootings in Chicago, where I'm from, and where you rightly said at the beginning of the show that 10 people died in the 24 hours after Sandy Hook.
So here's, I'm gonna try my best to make this make sense. So as the gentleman said, 4% of shootings of people who commit violent crimes have a mental illness, but there's a mental health component we're not talking about. I think it's the elephant in the room that we have to sort of walk into the room. So after Sandy Hook happens, which is a horrible, horrible tragedy, but unfortunately most shootings in this country are not happening in mass. Most of them are happening in urban communities across this country on black crime. So after the Sandy Hook shooting happens, 10 people get shot in Chicago. So one's going to ask, how could you see those horrible images of families suffering and then go out that night in Chicago on Friday night and actually shoot somebody, knowing of the suffering that just happened in Newtown, Connecticut.
Right.
And so what's happened is in 1973, we waged a war against our own people when we started the war on drugs. And for the past 40 years, we've been taking diseased people who are drug addicted, and some of them selling drugs, warehouse them in prison, and then put them back into the black and brown community and taught them how to be criminals while they were in prison, and brought criminal behavior and criminal culture back into the urban community. And these communities, these young people who are living in these communities are suffering, many of them, from mental health problems. They're walking around with walking PTSD, and at 16, 17, 18 years old, they feel hopeless, so they go out on Friday night after 20 kids have been killed in Sandy Hook Elementary School and shoot somebody else.
Priscilla?
That discussion we have to have.
Right.
Is he right?
Yeah, and the question, I'm glad you brought up black on black violence, because that's the community violence, right? So there's hordes of kids in this country growing up every day with watching violence in their communities. They're getting enculturated into this violent way of behaving.
So how do you dismantle the culture of violence?
It's so complicated. It's contextual. There's socioeconomic factors involved. You know, why do people live in violent neighborhoods? If people can afford to move out of them, they will. But a lot of people are trapped by poverty, by other reasons, and they remain in these cultures where they have to barricade their doors, their windows, their children. You know, we've seen, there's been articles on children growing up in these basically war zones in these violent neighborhoods.
Michael, I see you waving.
You got to start end the war on drugs. If you don't want to have violent community, don't treat young people like criminals. Mayor Bloomberg, who might be somewhat good on this gun issue, has also targeted an entire population in the city of New York with his racist policy of stop and frisk, which already assumes a young person, 93% of them who get pulled over are black and brown, and 90% of them are completely innocent, already assume that young person is guilty of a crime, and usually they're black and brown, so they're already looking at the police thinking that they are a criminal. So we must stop a war on drugs, stop treating our people like they are criminals, and maybe, just maybe, they'll think, oh, I'm not a criminal, I can go to college, or I can get a job, or I can improve my own community. That is a place we have to start. If we don't have that conversation, forget it. They're going to have more gun shootings every single year, and we'll have this conversation again next year, and more kids will be killing each other, and more school shootings will happen, and we'll be kidding ourselves that we actually want to stop this.
Priscilla, there's a tweet here from Richie, and who's echoing what's being said here. Mentally unwell and disconnected people in a violent and unequal society awash with firearms, this is a recipe for disaster, Richie says. And there's also a Facebook comment here from Bunga that I'd like you to address. He says, is this about policy or culture? I'd rather see it as the American culture. See their history. They used to protect their property by gun, which I don't find that kind of response to strangers in my part of the world. Is this a uniquely American phenomenon?
Right, and the person's right. So you can make policy changes, right? So change the laws and all of that. Until you change the culture, you're not changing anything. Okay, so, but it has to begin somewhere, and that's why we have laws, and that's why we fight to get the right laws instated, because once the laws are there, then you have something as a foundation to undergird the change in culture. So,
Michael, we've got about 1 minute left in the show, and we can continue this line of thinking in the post-show, but I want to get your thoughts on the role of this pop culture of violence on the movie industry, on the music industry. Does that have an impact? Got about 30 seconds for your answer.
It certainly has an impact. I think everybody has a responsibility. Everybody has to have some time for self-reflection after this horrible tragedy, after that tragedies every single day in this country. But I would say this about culture. Most culture is a reflection of society. So let's be careful not to break the mirror, but look at the mirror and see how we are the ones who might be guilty of this problem.
All right. We are running out of time for the main show, but we're going to continue this discussion in our online post show. So if you're not already there on your computer, go to stream.aljazeera.com and join us for the rest of this lively discussion. And thanks to all of our guests for joining us today. And we'll be looking to see you online. Welcome to the Stream's online post show. We're going to continue our discussion on this aftermath of the Sandy Hook shooting in Connecticut, where 20 children were gunned down. And of course, it raises the issues of gun control and of mental health and where those two things intersect. And is the discussion going to meaningfully change in America? One of the things that Americans have been doing since this event last Friday is struggling for answers. And there have been a lot of concerned parents wondering if Newtown could repeat itself. And some people argued that one idea was to consider allowing guns in schools. Take a look at the following clip. It's from Piers Morgan tonight on CNN.
Well, I believe that those of us who are licensed to carry are responsible people shouldn't be prohibited from carrying in schools or other places. In fact, the Michigan legislature just passed a bill last night and sent to the governor for signature, a bill that would allow those of us who are licensed to take one more day of training, including range time, and then actually be able to carry in the places where we couldn't carry before.
Eric, I want you to wrangle with this one. People who support this argument say that if you had an armed individual in the school or at the movie theater in Aurora, then the killer could have been confronted and maybe even stopped. Do you think arming school teachers could make kids safer?
Earlier this year, a man decided to execute his old boss in New York City, and he went up and shot him at point-blank range in front of the Empire State Building. 9 other people were injured by the police who came and started shooting. Those are people, that's their only job, is to fire their guns at criminals. They train their entire careers for it. There's other job titles called soldier, sniper, and that's all you do is handle weaponry. And it is hard to control gunfire when it's your only job. And anyone who's ever been in a shootout will tell you that it is very tough. And you're telling me you're going to put daycare teachers, 7th grade teachers, everyone's going to be armed in schools? That's an insane response. The police can't even do it properly when they train their entire lives. So I just don't even want to hear about that anymore.
Well, Michael, our community members are bringing us back to a point that was raised a little bit earlier on putting the onus on the gun manufacturers and the gun companies and, of course, the gun lobby. Davey says pro-gun activists like the NRA get huge kickbacks promoting the sale of guns from gun manufacturers. Why should they care? Of course, before you answer that, I think, of course, it's worth noting that the NRA did release a statement later saying that they're prepared to offer meaningful contributions to help make sure this never happens again. Michael, are we putting enough pressure?
Look, I think the NRA, they care. You know, they're human beings, and I'm sure they pain just as much as everybody else pains in this country what happened on Friday. But what I would say, they are certainly going to try to twist this conversation and make it about mental health and mental illness, which is a very important part of this problem. But it is not the norm for a young man to have a mental illness and go into a school and kill 20 children. That does not happen often, although it happens too much. It does not happen often. And I think that if they really truly care about the mental well-being of young people in this country, then they should be raising hell to fix that problem. And if they do not raise hell by mental illness, and they want to make this about that conversation, then they are just playing a game with the American people. We should see them for who they are, and we should sort of take them out of the equation of how we're going to solve this problem.
Adam, should the NRA and should gun manufacturers be leading the charge here? Should they be the voice that's appealing to gun advocates, saying, nobody wants to take away your weapons, certainly not us, the NRA or manufacturers, but something's got to give. We've got to shore things up. We can't allow people to buy weapons at gun shows or do personal transactions that are not tracked. Meanwhile, while a law-abiding citizen goes to a gun store, they go through a background check and have to go through proper procedures. We at least have to close the loopholes. Is it reasonable for them to be expressing that narrative right now?
I think that gun advocacy groups could be doing a lot to really change the way that we talk about these things. The government could also be doing a lot at a policy level to simply change how these processes works. We know, for instance, that the background checks that are supposed to happen on people buying guns don't work. Maybe about half the time, or in half the states, they're a requirement. Going back to the mental health problem, it's been a requirement since 1968 to check people who want to buy guns for a mental health history. So the fact that they're bringing that up in the conversation now doesn't really make a lot of sense either. Inevitably, it's something that we all have to work together on, and we're not going to make progress without the support of the gun
But
advocacy.
Priscilla, when we're talking about changing the culture, which is something you were talking about in the main show, doesn't that take strong voices that, in this case, would appeal to gun advocates to start changing the culture? Don't people take their cues from them?
Yeah, one of the things, I'll come back to your question. The way this person got the guns, he got it from his home.
From his mother.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally different from the other times that these mass shootings happen.
True.
So the culture of the home was such that there was an availability of guns there. And that's something that we need to address.
And some states have, but with children requiring trigger locks or gun safes or whatever, and there's a lower incidence of gun violence in those states.
Right.
But Adam, I'm sure would have been above the age limit.
Again, but you can have all those laws in place, but at home, what people do at home is important. And in this case, these guns were freely available for him to get. Yeah. And that's a problem. So it starts from the ground up, I think. It's the way children are reared at home around safety with guns and so on.
Michael, we've got about 1 minute left in our show. I want to give you the last word.
Oh, I just hope that the president and folks in Washington listen to the American people and really address this problem once and for all. I pray deeply for all those families that have lost. I just spoke to a mother this morning who lost her son 3 years ago to gun violence, and she still cries every single night when she goes to sleep. So I pray for all those families that have lost their children, especially during the holiday times when it's probably the toughest for them. And let's think about them and send them our prayers and our condolences and our well wishes, and hope this never, never, never happens again.
Well said. And thanks to all of our guests today, Priscilla, Michael, Eric, and Adam. Before we close the show, we do want to get to Malika. She's got a few other story leads that we're following.
As the world focuses on the U.S. school shooting, Chinese netizens are accusing state media of ignoring tragedy at home. Ministry of Tofu collected front-page coverage of the Newtown shooting from major Chinese newspapers. But a similar attack in China on the same day received almost no coverage. A man attacked a primary school in central China with a knife, wounding 22 children. Though no one died, Chinese web users said the attack deserved more coverage. One person on the social network Weibo wrote, "Major news outlets played deaf and dumb. It can only be learned from Weibo. Is it because the lives of Chinese children are worth less?" A local paper apologized for this front-page story following the stabbing, saying overlooking the attack hurt the feelings of the injured students and their families. Our next leads from Sweden, where 27 people were arrested following a protest against the owner of an Instagram account. The account solicited photos of girls along with speculations about their sex lives, gathering more than 6,000 followers with 200 photos. Angry students called for a protest at the school of the person believed to be responsible for the account. Take a look at what Swedish are describing as a riot. Swedes were shocked by the outburst, with one Twitter user writing, "Instagram riots in Sweden yesterday. Welcome to the 21st century, people." Well, let us know what you think of those stories by telling us using the hashtag AJStream. Lisa?
All right, now on Thursday, we are hours away from the world's end. As December 21st nears, we're going to look at why certain people around the world insist on believing in doomsday scenarios that never happen. And we're hoping this one won't happen either this week, but I'm sure you've got some thoughts and some questions on this topic. So send them our way, tweet us, Facebook us, send us a video comment, and between now and then, we'll see you online.